Chapter 19. When Bill again crossed the sanded floor of the wagon wheel, the sheriff and Ezra had pulled out. Marshal Moreland sat alone. He was in no mood for conversation. Jennies and pine knobs lay too heavy upon his mind. The squat rider dropped into his chair and moodily sipped his untasted drink. Moreland heaved to his feet and crunched towards the batwings. Bill grabbed the half-empty bottle of bourbon and grimly filled his glass to the brim. There was nothing left to do, he decided, but to get pie-eyed drunk. Phyllis Ford had turned him down. Mommy Rakestraw treated him worse than her saddle horses, and Plumford, a fellow he could have sworn was a square shooter, had been arrested for murder. He had been lost, and he had lost his girl, his partner, and his spread. He was a lone wolf on the wide prairie, and this was his night to hollow. As the level of the liquor in the bottle sank, so did Bill's spirits recede. When the bourbon finally hit the bottom, he rose upon bowed legs, a little unsteady but still sober, and rocked towards the bar. Midway he stopped, grasped a chair back for support, and stood squinting. Where formerly had stretched a long sweep of mahogany was now a tight-packed row of men's backs, and more were streaming in through the batwings like buzzards to a feast. A steady drone of talk rumbled through the smoke-wreathed saloon, but its tone was deep and savage. Gone was the customary heartility and loud exchange of good-natured chaff. The squat rider shook his head vigorously in an endeavor to clear his fogging brain. Something was amiss. What, he could not fathom. He elbowed through the press of bodies, bellied up to the bar, and steadied himself, and stared at the set faces of the townsmen that were crowded about him, reflecting in the long, gilt-tilted framed mirror back of the fast-moving bartender. Snatches of talk floated to his ears. "Why wait for a trail? The coyote buzzard," croaked Pete. "Let's string the rattlesnake up right now." "I'll gamble he hires a crooked mouthpiece and dodges the rope." "Pat Stevens pulled out for Dutch Springs. Now's our chance. Let's get a hemp committee together." Bill had heard enough. Booze was forgotten. They were framing to lynch Plumford. The hell with that stuff. Stubborn jaw set, he shouldered towards the plank walk. The shadows were lengthening, an ominous quiet brooding over Main Street, and there was not a woman in sight. The squat rider burst into the town marshal's office. Moreland was slumped at his desk smoking. "They're trying to stage a lynching bee," gasped Bill. The dog lobos are gathering at the wagon wheel right now. Yes, sir." "I was scared of that," growled Moreland. "That stiff-necked dude always stuck in their craws." He rose and nodded towards a rack in the corner, in which were standing 2 shotguns and a row of Winchesters. "Grab a scattergun back into the jail there and watch Plumford. I best hustle round and gather up some deputies." The burly marshal headed for the street. Bill gathered up a shotgun, lifted the key ring off the nail, and opened the door in the rear of the office. In the gloom, he fingered along a short passage. It was brought up short by a locked door. He fumbled with the keys, tried several, and finally felt the bolt snap back. Pushing through, he found himself in the enlarged addition of Moreland's shack. Plank partitions divided the room into 4 cells, 2 on either side of an alleyway. An aperture, a foot square, with crisscross iron bars, was cut in each door. Compared to Pat Stevens' steel-barred jail, the place was as flimsy as a hen house. Bill moved quickly from cell to cell, peering through the peepholes. 3 were empty. In the gloom of the last, he picked out the Englishman's figure hunched upon a low bunk. "Hey!" called Bill hoarsely, poking keys into the lock. Plumford rose listlessly. Bill kicked the door open. "There's framing to string you up, Plumford. Beat it." "I presume You mean they're contemplating a lynching? The Englishman replied. Why, that's ridiculous. It's against the law. Oh, for God's sakes, don't wrangle words, groaned Bill. The mob's getting all steamed up, and Moreland, he's gathering deputies. This is your chance. Get out of here. He grabbed Plumford by the shoulder and pressed him towards the passageway. But, protested the Englishman, pulling back, I refuse to take to my heels. That would be plain confession of guilt, and I am most certainly innocent. That won't help you any when you're up there hanging dry, cut in Bill. My buckskin is tied at the rail. You'd light a shuck. This is certainly most irregular, objected the prisoner, frowning with perplexity. The pair came out into the office. Outside, the street was deserted. Broad segments of yellow light slanting from saloon windows cut through the darkness. Bill set a Stetson on Plumford's head. Vamoose, he growled, in exasperation. With both hands he propelled the reluctant Plumford toward the door. It certainly goes against the grain, demurred the Englishman. With an angry snort, the squat rider shoved him out onto the plank walk. Fingering his 6-gun, he stood squarely in the doorway, blocking Plumford's return. The prisoner gazed round, darting an annoyed glance at Bill's stocky figure, then ducked reluctantly under the hitching rail and loosened the reins of the buckskin. Stiffly, he swung across the saddle and jogged down the street. Bill watched until the thud of his pony's hoofs died, and then, with a sigh of relief, turned back into the office. He carefully locked the door at each end of the passageway, dropping the keys out of sight behind the marshal's desk. This done, he settled himself comfortably in Moreland's chair and commenced building a smoke. Boots clumped heavily on the boards outside. The marshal ducked through the doorway, men stringing in at his heels. They filled into his office 6 men, grizzled and gray-haired. How come you're not in the back? Barked Moreland. I couldn't locate your dang keys. Moreland felt for the nail. Damn it, I could have sworn I hung 'em up here. Well, we haven't time to hunt now. He passed around the Winchesters and broke out 2 packages of shells. Crowded in the little shack, the hasty summoned deputies filled the magazines. Still, nothing moved in the gloom outside. The marshal stuck his head out of the doorway, surveying the silent street. There's trouble a-brewin'. I can smell it, he declared. His voice rose with quick excitement. Jumpin' grasshoppers, they're a-comin'. Listen, you Jaspers, no shootin' till I give word. Maybe we can spook 'em. He picked up the remaining shotgun, slid a shell into the breech, and moved ponderously outside. The deputies stampeded for the windows, staring out into the dark. In almost complete silence, a close-packed body of men, Bill figured there must have been 100, moving in a shadowy mass down the center of the street. Their boots thudded on the packed earth like the measured roll of a great muffled drum. There was something sinister and awe-inspiring in their steady advance. The leaders swung towards the office. The crowd behind them fanned out into a half-moon. What's on your mind, boys? Boomed Moreland. A man stepped forward, the lamplight from a saloon gleaming upon the barrel of a gun beneath his arm. We want that killer, he yelled. Come on out, the marshal flung over his shoulder. The deputies and Bill poured out the door and ranged themselves into a line behind Moreland's big form, their rifles level, belt high. Listen here, shouted the marshal for all to hear. We ain't standing for a lynching law in Danville. Plumford, he gets a fair trial. You break it up, fellers. If'n you want trouble, we're all set to give it to you in plenty. The leader spoke again. You ain't running no Sandy or us, Jem. You send that route out, or we'll smoke 'em out. Beat it, growled Moreland. With slow deliberation, he commenced to walk towards the mob, swinging the short-barreled shotgun in a short arc with his good arm. Bill's head was plenty clear now. Standing at the end of the line of deputies, he felt his pulse quicken and his grasp tighten upon the stock of the shotgun. One shot now, and hell would break loose. But at the marshal's approach, the tight-packed mass of men dissolved and scattered in all directions, diving into doorways and disappearing down alleyways. In a few minutes, the street was clear again, except for the leader standing alone. Almost in Moreland's face, he pointed his gun towards the stars and loosened one shot. "Quit!" yelled the marshal, grabbing for the gun. The fellow twisted to one side, dodging the marshal's clutching hand, and scurried across the street and disappeared. Moreland picked up his shotgun, which he had been compelled to drop, and tramped heavily back towards the line of deputies. The street was clear, but Bill could feel the impact of 100 eyes. "Get inside," grunted the marshal. Packed into the darkened office, the deputies fidgeted uneasily. It was quiet outside, too quiet. Bill sniffed, glanced around, sniffed again, but said nothing. A deputy suddenly broke the strained silence. "Something's afire!" Moreland charged across the room towards the lockup. Remembering the lost keys, raised a hefty boot and kicked out a panel. A choked cloud of smoke spewed into the office. Choking and gasping, the deputies surged through out to the plank walk. "God, they're roasting that hairpin back there inside," bawled the marshal. He flung his weight at the splintering door. It smashed open. With Bill at his heels, he lumbered down the smoke-filled passage. Flames were licking at the rear door. The heat drove him back, cursing with impotent anger. The pair retreated before the blaze, joining the little knot of deputies gathering outside on the plank walk. Tight features plain in the light of the fast-rising flames that greedily devoured the sun-shrunken timbers, they slowly backed into the street. Around, men lurked in the shadows, watching the inferno with hard eyes. Bill praised and breathed a prayer of thankfulness for the hunch that had led him to releasing Plumford. Once a fire started in Danville, it burned out. There was no water, save in an occasional barrels alongside the plank walks, and if they had water, nothing except buckets to throw it on the flames with. When gray dawn broke, a compact bunch of riders clattered down Main Street, the sheriff at their head. Pat's eyes were sober as he glimpsed the blackened remnants of the jail and the marshal's office. Tendrils of smoke still curled lazily from the ashes. Jim Moreland stepped mournfully off the plank walk. "Where's Plumford?" demanded the sheriff, voice sharp. "Fried to a crisp," grunted the marshal. "Mob was on the rampage last night and set a torch to the jail." "Good God," almost whispered Pat. Moreland glanced at his lean features with surprise. The sheriff was not given to emotion, particularly where the fate of callous murderers were concerned. Pat slipped from the saddle and walked close to the smoldering embers. "You find the remains?" "There weren't none," grunted Moreland. "He was done burnt with ashes." "Where was his cell?" The marshal indicated the far corner of the blackened site. Pat picked up a stick and poked around, his forehead knitted. Finally, he threw the stick aside. "Get your posse together, Jim." His voice again was crisp and decisive. "Round up a passel of ginnies and head for the W bar. We're going to be getting Cheyenne." He hit leather and wheeled the sorrel and led the posse out of town. Toward sundown the following day, 8 riders hazed a braying bunch of burros along the trail that wound towards the hills that ended up at Bar W. Jacks and Jennies, large and small, old and young, abandoned by prospectors and combed out of the hills around Danville, the assortment pattered along. In the drag, sweat-smudged Jim Moreland was cursing the sheriff's crazy notions and the animals that shuffled along at a snail's pace. At the Bar W, Pat surveyed his accusation with satisfaction. Moreland's deputies threw them into the corral to mingle with the animals that was packed out on the gold ore. The two lawmen hunkered in the shadow of a pine, and the sheriff laid out his plan of campaign. "We've got 22 men," he announced. "Plenty to take Cheyenne's bunch, if we can get through the gap. We can pull out at sunup. Every man packs a water bag, and I gathered some barrels we can rope to the backs of the biggest jacks. We'll spread our blankets overnight at Coyote Springs and then head for the gap. We should reach it by sundown." "Hell, by pushing the ponies a mite, we can raise the gap by midday," objected the marshal. "Trailing that herd?" Pat nodded towards the corral, thick with droopy-ear burros. "Creepin' rattlesnakes," ejected Moreland. "You ain't taking them critters along." "We need them," replied the sheriff shortly. "What in the hell for? You figuring on packing out the Mirage Mine lock, stock, and barrel?" Pat's lips quirked into a smile. "Hold your horses, Jim. You'll find out. Say, how come Bill ain't straddling his buckskin?" "How would I know?" grumbled the marshal. "Maybe the critter's burro shy. I sure got my stomach full of them blasted desert canaries." When the shadows licked across the alkali plain, a curious cavalcade crept northward beneath the bastions of the wall. Ahead, Pat and Moreland walked their ponies, and behind them plodded a straggling column of burros flanked by mounted men. Dropped well into the rear to avoid thick dust clouds churned up by scores of sharp hooves was the main body of the posse, and trailing them came Bill, a chain of sick burros on the lead, packing the precious water supply. That night, the posse made dry camp beneath the wall. At dawn, Pat and Moreland rode forward to survey the gap that was a mile ahead. Clear lined against the growing light of the rising sun, the massive cliffs between which the narrow canyon cut like a knife frowned down upon the two riders. They drew close, reined their ponies between the boulders that littered the mouth of the gap. A rifle shot whipped through the still air. The lead screamed over their heads. "Seems there's no visitors allowed," commented the sheriff dryly, wheeling his pony. They headed out into the plain. Beyond rifle shot, Pat leveled his glasses and searched the gap. "Never saw a worse death trap," he thought wearily. Bunched in that narrow canyon, with not enough cover to shelter a rabbit, an attacking force would be cut to pieces. To make the gap even more impregnable, a low rock wall blocked the far end. Pat could see the glint of sunlight upon rifle barrels as men passed behind it. Without a word, he passed the glasses to Moreland. The sheriff studied the canyon long and earnestly, and then with a grunt he heaved round. "Pat, we just can't make it." "Can we climb the wall?" Moreland eyed the towering rampart sloped away into the distance and then shook his head in somber negation. "Well, then we gotta make it." "But you can't send men in there. It's bloody murder," protested the marshal. "Well, not when we got the donkeys," smiled the sheriff. End of chapter 19.